I never thought my story would be one of betrayal and revenge. Growing up, I always believed that hard work, honesty, and dedication were the keys to success. My parents raised me with simple values. Work hard, treat people with respect, and in time the world will reward you. For most of my life, I clung to that belief like it was scripture. I was born in a small town in Ohio, far from the noise of big cities. My father was a factory worker, and my mother took care of the home and occasionally stitched clothes for neighbors to make some extra money. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. We lived somewhere in between, always with just enough to get by, but never enough to splurge. From an early age, I was obsessed with books. While other kids played outside, I often found myself buried in stories about successful people, entrepreneurs, and great leaders. I wanted to be like them. I wanted to rise above my circumstances and prove to myself, and maybe even the world, that I was capable of something greater. By the time I was in high school, I had already made up my mind. I was going to work in business. I didn't know exactly what role or what industry, but I knew I wanted to be in a place where decisions were made, where ideas had power, and where hard work could be seen. I wanted the kind of life my parents had dreamed of but never had the chance to live. College wasn't easy. I got into a decent university in the city, but money was always tight. I worked part-time jobs, waitressing, tutoring, even cleaning offices at night, just to cover my tuition and living expenses. Sometimes I was so exhausted I could barely stay awake in class. But quitting was never an option. Each sacrifice, each late night felt like an investment in my future. And finally, after years of struggle, graduation day came. My parents sat in the audience, their faces beaming with pride as I walked across the stage in my cap and gown. I remember locking eyes with my father as my name was called. He had tears in his eyes, and for a man as tough as him, that was rare. In that moment, I promised myself that everything I did moving forward would honor the sacrifices they had made for me. The job hunt after graduation was brutal. I sent out dozens of resumes, attended countless interviews, and faced rejection after rejection. "We're looking for someone with more experience," they'd say. It felt like a cruel joke. How was I supposed to gain experience if no one would give me a chance? Weeks turned into months, and my optimism began to fade. Then one morning I got an email that changed everything. It was from a mid-sized company in the city, Harper & Company. They were looking for a junior project coordinator. The role wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. My heart pounded as I read the words. "We are pleased to offer you the position," I screamed. I actually screamed out loud in my tiny apartment. After months of rejection, someone had finally believed in me. I called my parents, and my mother cried on the phone. My father, in his usual calm tone, said, "This is just the beginning, Emily. Remember, work hard, stay honest, and you'll go far." My first day at Harper & Company felt like stepping into another world. The office was sleek with glass walls, buzzing computers, and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Everyone looked so professional, dressed in sharp suits and carrying themselves with confidence. I felt small, almost like an imposter. But I reminded myself, I had earned this. I belonged here. That's when I met him, Mr. Collins, my boss. First, he seemed charming. He was in his early 40s, tall, with neatly combed hair and a warm smile that put people at ease. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and said, "Welcome to the team, Emily. We're glad to have you." Those words meant the world to me. I thought I had found a mentor, someone who would guide me and help me grow in my career. In the beginning, Collins seemed supportive. He'd check in on my progress, give me tips on how to navigate office politics, and even praise me in small ways. "Good work on that report," he'd say, or, "Nice initiative." I soaked it all in, grateful for any recognition. But looking back, I realized those early days were just a mask, a performance. Collins wasn't interested in mentoring me. He was interested in something else, something far more selfish. In those first few months, I poured every ounce of myself into the job. I was usually the first one in the office and the last to leave. My coworkers noticed, but they shrugged it off. For me, it wasn't just about impressing people, it was about survival. I needed to prove I belonged. Collins seemed to appreciate my effort. He would often call me into his office to discuss projects. "Emily," he'd say, leaning back in his leather chair, "you're sharp. I can see you going places." Those words lit a fire in me. Finally, someone was seeing what I had always known, that I had potential. He gave me tasks that were slightly above my pay grade. I didn't mind. In fact, I saw it as an opportunity. When he asked me to prepare a presentation for a client pitch, I worked through the night. I crafted slides, rehearsed speaking points, and even anticipated questions the clients might ask. The morning of the pitch, I handed him the complete deck. Later that day, I sat in the back of the conference room as Collins presented it. My heart pounded with pride as I watched the clients nod approvingly. But then as he moved from one slide to the next, I realized something. Not once did he mention my name. He spoke as if he had created everything himself. I brushed it off. Maybe it was normal. Maybe, as a boss, he had to present things as his own. Besides, I was new. I didn't want to come across as ungrateful or arrogant by expecting credit so soon. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern continued. I would stay late, perfecting reports, preparing strategies, writing proposals, and Collins would take them, polish them slightly, and present them as his own. In the beginning, I told myself it didn't matter. As long as the work was noticed, eventually my role would come to light. Still, there were moments of doubt. One evening, after another long day, I called my best friend, Sarah. She had known me since college and was one of the few people I could vent to. That's not right," she said after I explained what was happening. "I know," I sighed, pacing around my apartment. "But what can I do? He's my boss. I can't just confront him." Sarah's voice was sharp. "Listen, just be careful. People like that, they don't stop. If he's stealing your work now, he'll keep doing it until you're completely invisible." Her words stuck with me, but I pushed them aside. I told myself Collins was just giving me exposure, that in time someone higher up would notice. And then came the quarterly review meeting. It was the first time I would be evaluated formally since joining. I was nervous but excited too. I thought maybe Collins would highlight my contributions. Instead, as we sat across from each other in his office, he smiled and said, "Emily, you've been doing great supporting the team. Keep it up." That was it. No mention of the late nights. No acknowledgement of the work I had carried on my back. Just a vague pat on the head. I forced a smile, but inside something cracked. It was the first time I wondered if my dream job might be turning into something else. A place where my voice would never be heard. Still, I kept pushing. I didn't want to give up so easily. When the company landed a major client in the spring, Collins asked me to draft a full strategy proposal. "This is high stakes," he told me. "I need your best." For 2 weeks, I gave everything I had. I skipped social events, barely ate, barely slept. I researched, analyzed data, and designed a proposal I was truly proud of. The night before the presentation, Collins stopped by my desk. "Got it ready?" he asked. I handed him the neatly bound packet. He smiled. "Perfect. I'll take it from here." The next morning, I sat in the back again, heart racing as Collins walked the executives through my work. This time I waited. Surely he would mention me. Surely he would give me some recognition in front of the higher-ups. But he didn't. He finished the presentation, shook hands with the executives, and basked in their praise. And once again I was invisible. When the meeting ended, I lingered behind. One of the executives, Mr. Howard, passed by and patted Collins on the back. "Brilliant work as always, Collins," he said. Then he glanced at me, smiled politely, and walked on. "Brilliant work as always, Collins." The words echoed in my head. That night I cried. Not because I wanted fame or glory, but because I felt erased. I was giving everything, my time, my energy, my creativity. And in return I was being used as a shadow. I told myself things would change. I told myself it was just the way the corporate world worked. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. And once a seed is planted, it only grows. The following months blurred together in a haze of endless work and hollow recognition. My job title hadn't changed, but the responsibilities piled on. Whenever Collins had something difficult or time-consuming, he would casually slide it across my desk. "Emily, you're good at this," he'd say, as if it were a compliment. At first, I took pride in being the dependable one. But slowly, I began to realize I wasn't being groomed for success. I was being exploited. One Friday evening, after everyone had left, Collins approached my desk. He leaned against the cubicle wall, arms folded. "Emily, I need you to finish the market analysis by Monday morning. Big client meeting first thing. I blinked at him. But it's Friday night. He shrugged as if that excused everything. I know you can handle it. Besides, this is your chance to shine. Shine. That word again. A word that dangled like bait in front of me, promising something that never seemed to arrive. So I stayed. While my friends posted pictures from weekend getaways, I sat under the cold office lights, crunching numbers and typing reports. At 2 a.m., when I finally closed my laptop, I felt a hollow sense of achievement. I was doing the work of someone 2 levels above me, but my paycheck hadn't changed a cent. Sarah noticed the toll it was taking on me. One Saturday morning, when I canceled plans with her again, she snapped. "Emily, wake up!" she shouted through the phone. "He's using you. Do you think he'll suddenly give you credit after all this time?" I bit my lip, torn between loyalty and reality. I can't risk it, Sarah. What if speaking up ruins everything? She sighed. What if staying silent ruins you? Her words lingered in my mind for days. The office, once a place of hope, began to feel suffocating. Collins's charm had worn off, revealing something colder underneath. He was always polite in public, but behind closed doors, there was a sharpness in his tone, a subtle reminder of who held the power. "Emily, don't overstep," he warned one afternoon when I suggested a new approach during a team meeting. "Leave the big ideas to management." The sting of humiliation burned my cheeks. I swallowed my words and forced a smile, but inside I was screaming. The big ideas? They're mine. They've always been mine. Things came to a head during the company's annual review presentation. This was the moment when each department showcased its achievements to the entire executive board. Collins had been nervous for weeks, and of course, he handed the preparation to me. I spent 3 weeks building that presentation. I gathered data, designed visuals, wrote scripts, everything. By the time it was finished, it was a masterpiece. I felt proud, maybe even hopeful, that finally someone would notice my efforts. On the day of the presentation, I sat in the crowded auditorium, heart pounding as Collins took the stage. My slides glowed on the giant screen, my charts, my words. And then he began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a confident smile, "I'm proud to share the results of our department this year. I've worked tirelessly to bring these insights together. I've worked tirelessly." Every word after that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. He spoke with authority, weaving my ideas into his narrative, stealing not just the work but the story behind it. And the executives applauded. They praised him. They looked at him as if he were some kind of genius. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream, "That's mine. Those are my words, my late nights, my sacrifice." But my body froze. Fear held me down like chains. Afterward, as the applause faded, Collins basked in the glory. Executives congratulated him, colleagues admired him, and I slipped away quietly, invisible once again. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling. Something inside me cracked. For the first time, I admitted the truth I had been avoiding for months. Collins wasn't a mentor. He was a thief. And if I didn't do something, he would keep stealing until there was nothing left of me. The days after the annual presentation were some of the darkest of my life. Everywhere I turned in the office, people congratulated Collins. "Great work," they said. "Impressive analysis." I smiled politely when they glanced at me, but inside I was drowning. I couldn't focus. My motivation, once limitless, had crumbled. I would stare at my computer screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to type. What was the point? Whatever I created would just be stolen, repackaged, and paraded around as someone else's genius. One evening, as I sat at my desk long after everyone else had left, I whispered to myself, "I can't live like this." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the silence of the empty office pressed down on me. For the first time, I began to imagine walking away, leaving the company, starting fresh somewhere else. But then another thought struck me. Why should I be the one to leave? Why should I let Collins push me into the shadows while he reaped the rewards of my labor? No, that wasn't going to happen. Not anymore. The next morning, I walked into the office with a strange new energy. I wore my sharpest blazer, held my head higher, and forced myself to look people in the eye. Collins greeted me with his usual smug grin. "Morning, Emily," he said casually, as if nothing had happened. But this time I saw him differently. Not as my boss, not as a mentor, but as a predator. A man who thrived on the talent of others. And predators, I reminded myself, could be outsmarted. That realization was the turning point. I wasn't ready to act yet, not without a plan, but the seed had been planted. The seed of resistance. The seed of revenge. It grew quietly at first. I started paying closer attention, watching Collins not as a leader but as a target. I noticed how he spoke to different people, how he manipulated conversations, how he twisted narratives to make himself look better. I began to catalog his behavior in my mind, as if I were studying a case. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to be my sounding board. One night over coffee, I confessed everything. I feel like I'm disappearing, Sarah. Like he's erasing me. She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. Then stopped letting him. Emily, you're smarter than he is. You've got to think ahead. Her words echoed in my head for days. Think ahead. For weeks, I walked a fine line, doing my work, pretending to be the same obedient employee, while inside I was preparing. Not for confrontation yet, but for survival. For proof. And then one small incident lit the fuse. I had drafted a minor proposal. Nothing groundbreaking. Just an internal suggestion for improving workflow. Collins skimmed it, nodded, and tossed it aside. I thought nothing of it, until a week later during a team meeting, he presented the exact same proposal as his own brilliant idea. My colleagues clapped. I sat frozen, the same familiar rage boiling inside me. But this time, instead of tears, I felt something sharper. Resolve. That night, as I sat at my desk alone once again, I opened a new folder on my computer. I labeled it simply Proof. Inside that folder, I saved the draft of my proposal, along with timestamps and emails that showed it was mine. For the first time, I realized the power of evidence. It was a small step, but it was the beginning. The beginning of a plan I hadn't yet fully formed. The beginning of a fight I hadn't yet waged. And the beginning of the end for Mr. Collins. Because if he wanted to keep stealing from me, I was going to make sure one day, the theft would expose him for exactly what he was. I used to believe betrayal was a dramatic event. A sudden knife in the back. A shocking twist that left you breathless. But in reality, betrayal is quieter. It's a slow erosion. A steady drip of thefts and lies until one day you realize you're standing on nothing but sand, and the ground beneath you has already collapsed. That was how Collins worked. He didn't just steal one idea. He stole them all, piece by piece, with such casual confidence that people simply assumed the brilliance belonged to him. The first few times, I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe he had thought of the same idea. Maybe I was being paranoid. But deep down I knew. The proof folder on my computer kept growing. Each file a small act of resistance. Emails, drafts, meeting notes, anything that showed the origin of my work went in there. It became my secret weapon, hidden behind an ordinary folder name that no one would think twice about. But even with evidence, I felt powerless. After all, what good were documents if nobody believed me? Collins had charisma, charm, and authority. I was just me. That feeling of invisibility returned, heavier than before. Until one afternoon when everything changed. We were in a client meeting, one of those high-stakes moments that determined whether the company kept its contracts. I had spent days preparing the presentation. A detailed forecast model, polished visuals, and a strategy that I was proud of. The moment came. Collins cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smile, "I'd like to walk you through a strategy I've been developing." My stomach dropped. I recognized the slides immediately. My slides. Word for word, image for image, he paraded my work as though it had come straight from his brain. I sat there, forced to nod politely while the clients praised him. Inside, my pulse hammered so hard I thought my chest might burst. Afterward, one of the clients leaned toward me during the break. "You must be proud to work under someone so visionary," she whispered. I smiled thinly, unable to speak. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the growing proof folder. And for the first time I made a vow out loud. I'm going to end him. It startled me, hearing the words spoken in my own voice. But they felt true. They felt inevitable. Still, revenge couldn't be impulsive. If I lunged now, he would crush me. I needed to be patient. to watch, to learn, to wait for the exact moment when his mask would crack. So I began observing Collins with new eyes. He wasn't invincible. Beneath the charm, he was careless. He sent sloppy emails. He sometimes forgot who he'd lied to. He basked in attention so much that he rarely noticed the quiet ones watching from the corner, people like me. And as I watched, I realized something powerful. His greatest strength, that blinding confidence, was also his weakness. He thought he could never be caught. That arrogance would be his downfall. But to bring him down, I needed more than stolen ideas in a folder. I needed a story so undeniable, so clear, that even the most loyal executive would see him for what he was. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. I was ready to play the long game. The vow I made that night didn't vanish with the morning sun. If anything, it grew stronger. Every time Collins smiled at me across the office, every time he clapped me on the back and called me his right hand, I heard the echo of my own voice whispering, "I'm going to end him." The office became my battlefield. At first, nobody noticed the subtle ways I began to shift my behavior. I wasn't reckless. I couldn't afford recklessness. But I started listening more closely in meetings, watching for the cracks in Collins's polished facade. And there were cracks. Collins had a temper, one he worked hard to conceal. In private, I'd seen flashes of it. The way his jaw tightened when someone dared to question him. The way his eyes narrowed if he felt ignored. He hated being challenged. It was like watching a child sulk. Except this child held the power to destroy careers. I filed that away in my mind. Collins cannot tolerate being exposed. Meanwhile, my proof folder grew heavier. I started backing it up on encrypted drives, storing copies in places even I sometimes forgot. If Collins tried to destroy me, he'd find that I'd already spread the truth like seeds in the wind. But evidence alone wasn't enough. People don't always believe facts, they believe stories. And Collins was a master storyteller. If I wanted to beat him, I had to craft a narrative stronger than his lies. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One morning, a junior analyst named David came to me looking pale. "Emily," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "I need to tell you something. But you can't let him know it came from me." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" David swallowed hard. "That quarterly report you've been working on? Collins told me to give him the draft you shared last night. He said he needed to polish it up before presenting it. But when I checked the version this morning," his voice faltered. "What about it? He removed your name entirely. Every reference to you. It looks like he built the whole thing himself." I should have been surprised. But I wasn't. The anger that rose in me was no longer fiery. It was cold, steady, like ice forming over a lake. "Thank you, David," I said softly. That night, I didn't add the report to the proof folder. Instead, I opened a new document, one I titled simply, "The Plan." Line by line, I began sketching out how I would dismantle Collins. Not just expose him, dismantle him. I started small. A quiet correction here, a whispered truth there. At a networking event, when someone praised Collins's unique strategy, I smiled and said, "Yes, it was an interesting adaptation of the framework I shared with him." Then I walked away, leaving just enough doubt to linger in their minds. Collins didn't notice at first. Why would he? He was too busy basking in his own glow. But small seeds of doubt are powerful. Once planted, they grow. Meanwhile, I watched him more closely. He worked late but rarely produced anything original. His genius was an illusion, a patchwork quilt sewn from other people's brilliance. The realization fueled me. If I kept collecting threads and pulling carefully, the entire fabric of his persona would unravel. But even as I strengthened my resolve, I knew I couldn't rush. Revenge isn't about speed. It's about precision. And I was determined that when Collins finally fell, he would fall hard enough that he could never rise again. What I didn't know was how close that moment already was. If revenge is a chess game, then evidence was my pawns and patience my clock. Every small move had to be deliberate. Every public nudge had to be calibrated so that it looked accidental. A stray comment, a helpful correction, never vindictive. The goal was to make Collins stumble under his own hubris, not to appear as someone doing the stomping. I began with people I trusted. David had given me the first tip. He became my quiet confidant. There were others, two coworkers who had complained over drinks about being overlooked. Interns who had been asked to work through weekends without recognition. They weren't rebels. Most of them were simply tired. Tired of watching a man take what wasn't his and build an empire of applause on other people's labor. I didn't ask them to march into Collins's office and declare war. I simply started planting seeds. In casual conversations near the coffee machine, I would mention a detail only someone who actually worked on a project would know. A phrase I used in a slide, the source of a quirky analogy, the late-night statistic I'd pulled from an obscure dataset. I said these things softly, with no accusation attached. Just information. Little paint strokes that, when seen by the right people, would gradually redraw the picture. I also started to professionalize my evidence. No more scattered timestamps and ad hoc screenshots. I created a timeline, a document tracing the origin of ideas, the drafts, the emails, the versions. Each entry had dates, file names, and short notes. Sent draft V2 to Collins, 03/12/20XX, 2314. Included slide on market segmentation. I backed it up in 3 places. An encrypted external drive, a cloud folder with type permissions, and a physical printout locked in my desk drawer. I was building a file that, if needed, could be presented in a boardroom and would read like a clear, undeniable narrative. The more methodical I became, the bolder I felt. The thrill wasn't malicious, it felt righteous. There's a distinct clarity that comes when you stop pretending and start protecting yourself. For months I had been complicit in my own erasure by staying mute. Now I was reclaiming my story. Collins predictably made mistakes. Overconfidence has a way of making people sloppy. He forwarded me an email he thought was private. A rant to a recruiter about how easy it was to spin other people's work. He hit reply all instead of reply. I stared at my screen as the words unspooled. She did most of it, but who cares? I'll present it better. It was petty and damning. I didn't react to the email. I saved it. That message, like a glinting arrowhead, found its place in my timeline. But evidence without credibility can be dismissed as malice. Executives are trained to protect reputations. They hedge toward the manager who brings numbers and appearance. So while I continued my quiet work of documentation, I turned to building credibility for myself, small public wins that could not be easily rebranded. I volunteered for internal trainings and asked to lead small segments in department meetings. I began writing short, well-researched memos and sending them to people outside our team, people who had no reason to be invested in our petty politics. One of those memos landed in the inbox of Marta from legal, someone known for her impartiality. She replied with a thoughtful question about a data point I'd cited, an engaged professional exchange. It was the sort of interaction that, on paper, read as competence. My name was starting to appear in places other than the margins. That was important. When the time came to present my case, I needed an audience that would listen without bias. Building my credibility was like building scaffolding. It would support the narrative when the reveal came. Then Providence, or perhaps karma, supplied me with a golden, unforced moment. During a cross-departmental meeting about a new client pitch, Collins was slated to present the core strategy. Unknown to him, I had been quietly working with Amelia from research to refine one of the most unpredictable segments, the competitor analysis. Amelia was thorough and, crucially, principled. She hated seeing sloppy work passed off as brilliance. 30 minutes before the meeting, Amelia cornered me in the hallway, eyes wide. "Emily, I think he's using your lines in the deck again. He changed the authorship to himself and removed references. I don't like it." Her voice was low but steady. "If you want, I'll back you up." That 3-word offer, "I'll back you up," hit me like a jolt of warm light. Having someone from another credible team willing to stand beside me made everything less lonely, and a lot more possible. At the meeting, as Collins launched into his polished spiel, I watched Amelia from across the room. She had a small notepad and she was taking notes. Later, during the Candé, a junior partner asked an insightful question about the competitor data. Collins fumbled for a response, and in that tiny window, Amelia interjected with a precise correction that matched my original analysis. People in the room exchanged glances. The correction sounded familiar to some. It was a small crack, but it widened the doubt. Back at my desk later that day, Amelia sent me a private message. "We need to document this. I have some emails you should see." She attached a few threads that corroborated the flow of ideas, threads in which I was included, and which Collins had not shared with the larger group. With Amelia's help, the timeline became richer. She tested my drafts against the versions Collins presented. The contrasts were stark. Where my drafts had nuanced caveats and source attributions, his versions glossed over complexity and presented conclusions as sweeping truths. It became increasingly obvious that the intellectual labor was mine while the public face was his. As we worked together, I learned something crucial. You don't need to be loud to be effective. Quiet allies, well-placed facts, and a careful dossier can do what rants and rage never could. Amelia had the credibility of the research team. David had the insider perspective. Marta from legal had shown professional interest. My network of small, credible voices was forming like a web, each strand reinforcing the next. Collins, meanwhile, began to show signs of agitation. The first time I noticed it was a casual exchange in the elevator. He smiled at me in the way he always did, but his greeting seemed forced. "You've been very visible lately," he said, eyes darting. There was no warmth in the words. It felt like a caution, not a compliment. I simply smiled back and said, "Just trying to help the team." I didn't add anything else. I had learned the value of saying less. In private, I continued my defensive work. I labeled files clearly with my name and date. I included versions in collaborative documents that showed the evolution of ideas from my initial outline to the final product. I sometimes CC'd myself on drafts in such a way that the timestamp would reflect ownership. It wasn't pretty espionage, it was meticulous bookkeeping. But it was effective. Weeks passed. Small exposures accumulated. A skeptical email here, an offhand correction there. The web of doubt stretched taut over Collins's illusions. And yet, every night when I left the office, when the city lights blurred into the shape of my small apartment, I still felt the pressure. Revenge had become a long, quiet habit that required constant vigilance. The stakes were real: careers, reputations, livelihoods hanging in the balance. I told myself to be careful. I told myself to stay patient. Because in a game like this, the wrong rush could topple everything. But I also felt a strange, steady confidence I hadn't known in years. For the first time since joining Harper & Company, I felt less like a ghost and more like a person taking up space. That feeling alone, the simple act of reclaiming voice and ownership, was intoxicating. The trap was set. The net was woven, strong and patient. Now it just needed a final, undeniable pull. The funny thing about arrogance is that it always overreaches. Collins had gotten away with so much for so long that he no longer even bothered to hide his theft. His charm, once smooth and disarming, was fraying at the edges. By then, my plan had grown beyond simple documentation. I wasn't just keeping receipts. I was orchestrating moments. Carefully, deliberately, I set the stage so that Collins would expose himself. The opportunity came during the biggest project of the quarter, the Meridian account. It was a multi-million-dollar pitch, the kind that made or broke reputations. The entire office buzzed with tension, and Collins was desperate to prove himself indispensable. Of course, the core strategy was mine. I had spent nights building a layered approach, one that combined competitor mapping, emerging market opportunities, and behavioral forecasting. I was proud of it and terrified. If Collins stole this and landed the account, his star would rise higher than ever. My name would vanish completely, so I decided to gamble. I gave Collins a version of the deck, polished, professional, but with deliberate gaps. Missing citations. A few statistics slightly off. A critical slide that ended abruptly, as though something had been cut. It looked complete enough to impress at a glance but brittle enough to crack under real scrutiny. Meanwhile, I kept the true version tucked safely away. The day of the presentation arrived. The room was full. Executives, the Meridian clients, department heads. Collins strutted to the front like a man about to conduct a symphony. He launched into the deck with his usual confidence, smiling, gesturing, spinning his story. And at first it worked. People nodded. A few jotted notes. Collins thrived on the attention, his voice swelling with self-importance. Then came the slide with the missing citation. One of the clients leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said, tapping her pen. "Where did you source this data?" Collins blinked. His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to her. He hesitated for half a second too long. Internal research," he said smoothly. The client frowned. Strange. We track similar numbers and yours don't align. Could you explain the discrepancy? A murmur rippled through the room. Collins shifted, his composure cracking just slightly. I'd need to check with my team. My team. He said it as if the idea had sprung fully formed from his mind, as if I hadn't been the one poring over spreadsheets at 2 a.m. The questions kept coming. Why was a competitor missing from the forecast? Why did a trend line end abruptly? With each inquiry, Collins's answers grew vaguer, more strained. His polished mask was slipping, and for the first time people noticed. I sat there silently, pulse steady, watching the unraveling. My fingerprints were invisible. All I had done was give him rope. He was the one tightening the noose. Finally, Marta from legal spoke up. She wasn't supposed to be part of the discussion, but her voice carried weight. Actually, she said, turning her gaze toward me, I recall Emily mentioning a different dataset in her memo last month. Emily, would you like to clarify? The room turned to me. My heart thudded once hard, but I kept my voice calm. Yes, I said evenly. I'd be happy to share the full analysis later. This version seems incomplete. Incomplete. That word hung in the air like smoke. Collins forced a laugh, but the damage was done. The clients exchanged looks. The executives scribbled notes. For the first time, Collins didn't look like a visionary. He looked sloppy. After the meeting, he stormed into my office, slamming the door behind him. His face was red, his voice sharp. What the hell was that? Did you set me up? I looked at him coolly. You asked for my draft, remember? He glared, chest heaving. Then, slowly, he composed himself, straightened his jacket, and leaned closer. His voice dropped to a hiss. Don't play games with me, Emily. You won't win. But his eyes betrayed him. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear there. Just a flicker, but real. When he left, I sat in silence, my hands trembling not from fear but from exhilaration. The net had tightened and he had walked straight into it. He still had power, of course. He could still hurt me. But the facade was cracking, and once cracks appear, they only spread. When Collins faltered in that Meridian meeting, it felt less like victory and more like permission. The permission wasn't to celebrate, not yet, but permission to be deliberate, to stop hiding and to move with the confidence I'd been training myself to find. A man like Collins could rebuild his image if he wanted to. He could charm and misdirect and spin. But I had something he couldn't manufacture. The truth, documented and patient. Planning revenge is an ugly phrase. I hated how it sounded. I didn't see myself as vengeful for the sake of cruelty. I saw myself as someone reclaiming the work of her life, and the dignity that came with it. In my head I called it the plan, capitalized because it deserved seriousness. It had 3 pillars: proof, allies, and timing. Proof was already well underway. The timeline grew, files organized into neat folders with names that looked boring at a glance. Q1_drafts, Meridian final, client threats. Behind those dull labels were drafts with track changes, old emails with my name on them, auto-saved versions from 2 in the morning that showed my hand in every line. I even dug back into archived versions of documents, pulling metadata to show file creation dates. It was tedious forensic work, but every brittle fact I unearthed felt like a brick in a foundation that could not be ignored. Allies were the next piece. I didn't need an army, but I needed credibility that extended beyond my desk. Amelia from research had already shown herself to be principled. David was quietly brave. Marta from legal was perceptive. I reached out slowly, not with accusations but with collaboration. I shared small excerpts of my timeline. Nothing explosive, just enough to show patterns. Each person I recruited wasn't joining a vendetta. They were committing to fairness. That framing was crucial. No one wanted to feel like a pawn, but everyone cared about integrity. Timing, though, was the most delicate. You can have proof and you can have allies, but if you blow your cover at the wrong moment, you simply hand the narrative back to the thief. I needed a setting where the evidence would be irrefutable and the audience unavoidable. An executive review, a board meeting, an official audit. Somewhere Collins's charm couldn't paper over facts. So I began scanning the company calendar like a hunter scans the terrain. There was a month-long audit scheduled in 3 weeks, a formal process with external advisors and legal oversight. If I presented my dossier during an audit, The process would naturally validate evidence. It would be procedural, slow, and lethal to he said she said defenses. That's what I wanted. Procedure would be an ally, not the enemy. I imagined the auditors tracing versions and seeing timestamps, seeing consistent evolution from my earliest drafts to the final proposals. In that environment, Collins's assertions would be precisely the kind of thing that raised red flags. Preparing for that audit became my full-time second job. I refined the timeline into a presentation, not flashy, not theatrical, but utterly clear. Slide 1. The high-level summary of the Meridian account and other projects with discrepancies. Slide 2. A chronological timeline with file names and timestamps. Slide 3. Corroborating emails and witness notes. David's messages, Amelia's confirmations. Slide 4. Specific instances showing text verbatim from my drafts that appeared later in Collins's presentations without attribution. I annotated every slide with dates and short captions so there was no need for rhetoric, only facts. I rehearsed the delivery silently in my head. I pictured a neutral, professional voice laying out the case. Here are the artifacts. Here are the dates. Here are the inconsistencies. I would not dramatize. I would not plead. The plan depended on calmness. Drama makes people defensive. Facts, in contrast, make people think. There were practicalities to consider, too. If Collins suspected, he could delete files, manipulate email threads, or call me into a private meeting where he'd try to intimidate me. I preempted all that by creating redundancies. Copies of the most crucial files lived on a hardware drive at Sarah's apartment, in my encrypted cloud folder, and in a locked cabinet in my desk. I also made a habit of emailing small, innocuous notes to people outside our team that contained snippets of my work. That way, even if someone tried to erase my local files, the digital breadcrumb trail would remain. It felt paranoid at times, but I'd rather be paranoid than erased. The emotional labor of this phase was heavy. I had to be two people at once. The smiling, helpful colleague who could sit next to Collins in meetings and take notes, and the quiet archivist who cataloged evidence and checked metadata late into the night. At home, I drafted timelines and then walked away to make dinner as if nothing unusual were happening. I learned to compartmentalize in a way I'd never known was possible. An unexpected byproduct of the plan was that I started sleeping better. Strange but true. Sleepable confidence came from control. When you stop flailing and begin arranging things, you feel agency. The small victories, a confirmation email from Amelia, a forwarded thread from David that included my earlier draft, felt like fuel. Each verified detail reduced the anxiety that had haunted me for months. Still, there were moral moments I had to wrestle with. Was I stooping to his level? Was there a danger I'd become what I hated? I thought about that often and came to a quiet conclusion. The difference between revenge and justice was intent. Collins's intent had always been self-advancement at the cost of others. My intent now was restoration to restore truth to its rightful owner. That reasoning steadied me. As the audit date neared, I tightened small bolts. I rehearsed what I would say if an executive asked a question. I wrote out simple, factual responses that didn't sound defensive. I coordinated with Amelia and Marta to ensure they would corroborate if called upon. I decided on a single phrase I would use if the room grew tense. I'm here to present evidence, not to cast blame. That line was my anchor. One afternoon, Collins called me into his office. My stomach dropped the way it used to on the nights I thought I'd be given credit. He smiled in that way that had, for so long, made me disarmingly nervous. "Emily," he said smoothly, "the audit is coming up. How are you preparing?" His tone implied control, a leash I was supposed to tug. I met his gaze and said evenly, "I'm compiling materials and ensuring everything is documented." I didn't volunteer anything more. It was a tiny moment of defiance, but the air in his office shifted. He tried to mask it with corporate small talk, but there was a new wariness in his eyes. Whether he suspected me or simply felt the winds change, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer the invisible one. That evening, I parked at my desk and opened the timeline one last time. I reviewed slide by slide, date by date. The plan felt solid. Procedure would do the rest. Facts would do the rest. My role would be to be prepared, composed, and utterly factual when the auditors asked. I woke the next morning with a nervous clarity. The plan had weight now, But it also had the fragility of a house of cards that would topple if someone rushed or lied. The coming days felt like a countdown. Each tick brought me closer to a point of truth. And yet, even with my nerves, there was the quiet thrill of inevitability. For months I had been the ghost in the room. Soon I would be the voice with evidence. The power balance was tilting. The predator I had once feared was beginning to feel vulnerable. I sat at my desk and whispered to myself, not with malice but with a calm resolve. When the time comes, I will speak. I will not be afraid. The days leading up to the audit stretched like wire pulled taut. Every interaction hummed with subtext. Every conversation with Collins felt like sparring in a ring I wasn't supposed to enter. But I stayed disciplined. The plan depended on steadiness, not impulse. The first step was refining the dossier into something unshakable. I treated it as though it weren't mine at all, as if I were preparing evidence for someone else's trial. That distance helped me cut fluff, remove anything subjective, and let the data speak for itself. The final document was 60 pages, drafts with timestamps, email threads with headers, side-by-side comparisons of Collins's final decks against my original notes. No narration, no editorializing, only artifacts. Late one night, sitting at my kitchen table with Sarah peering over my shoulder, I whispered, "Do you think it's too much? 60 pages is heavy." She shook her head. Heavy is good. Heavy means no one can brush it aside. If you go in with 3 screenshots in a story, they'll dismiss you. 60 pages forces them to look. Her certainty steadied me. I also began quiet check-ins with my allies. Amelia and I met for coffee near the office. I showed her just one section, an email thread where Collins had forwarded my draft to himself at 2:13 a.m., then attached a new idea to leadership less than a day later. She scanned the pages, her brows drawing together. "It's blatant. Almost lazy." He didn't even bother to reformat it. "Will you stand by this if you're asked?" I asked carefully. Amelia didn't hesitate. "Yes. If the auditors ask, I'll tell them what I saw." David was more cautious. We met in the break room after hours, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence. I slid him one printed page, a section of the Meridian draft showing track changes with both our names, followed by Collins's final deck. David frowned. "He stripped our names out completely." I nodded. "I don't want you to take risks you can't handle. But if someone asks," he sighed, "I'll answer honestly. I can't promise more." That was enough. Truth, when spoken plainly, was more powerful than loyalty. Marta from legal was the sharpest. She looked at a few documents I shared and said, "Metadata is your strongest weapon. Anyone can claim coincidence or collaboration, but metadata has no opinion. If you present timestamps, creation history, version control, it becomes forensic. Frame your case like evidence, not emotion." I absorbed her advice like gospel. I refined the dossier again, stripping it of commentary until it read like an audit report. Meanwhile, Collins seemed restless. Twice he appeared at my desk with casual questions. "How's your workload?" Or, "Need me to review anything before the audit?" Each time I offered him bland, neutral responses. He was testing, sniffing the air like a predator sensing smoke. One afternoon he leaned against my cubicle wall, too close, too relaxed. "Emily, you've been doing good work lately," he said, his smile sharp at the edges. "I think it's important to keep our team unified during the audit. You know how outsiders can misunderstand things." I met his gaze and gave him the smallest smile I could manage. "That's why I'm making sure everything is clearly documented." His eyes narrowed for just a second before the smile returned. He patted the wall of my cubicle and walked away. But in that fleeting moment I saw it. The flicker of unease. He didn't know what I had, but he knew I had something. That night, alone in my apartment, I rehearsed. I practiced answering the kinds of questions auditors might ask. Who authored this draft? Here is the metadata showing my authorship. Were you aware Mr. Collins presented this as his own? I observed him present it. Here is the comparison. Do you claim ownership of the project? I claim documented contribution. The evidence speaks for itself. I practiced until the answers came without hesitation, until I sounded not like a victim or an accuser, but like a witness delivering fact. Calm, concise, irrefutable. As the audit drew closer, the office felt electric. Collins grew louder in meetings, sharper with his jokes, more domineering in casual chats. It was theater, I realized, a performance of confidence for anyone who might have noticed his cracks. I, in turn, performed invisibility, diligent, cooperative, boring. If he looked too closely, he'd find the arsenal I had been building. But beneath the surface, everything was shifting. I could feel it in the way Amelia gave me small, supportive glances across the table, or the way Marta dropped by my desk and casually reminded me to make multiple backups. The web was tightening around him, thread by careful thread. One evening, as I closed my laptop on the 60-page dossier, I whispered to myself, the plan isn't about bringing him down. It's about making the truth undeniable. And for the first time, I almost believed I was ready. The week before the audit felt like living under a storm cloud. Every sound was sharper. Every interaction carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Collins's laughter was louder, his commands harsher, and yet his eyes kept darting toward me as though I were a shadow he couldn't shake. I could sense the paranoia settling into him. On Wednesday, he called an impromptu team meeting. We gathered in the glass conference room, the city sprawling behind him. He paced like a man performing, his voice booming. "We have an audit coming," he said, "and I want to make sure we're all aligned. No surprises, no miscommunication. We've built something extraordinary here. And I expect loyalty from my team." His eyes swept the room but lingered on me. I held his gaze, expression neutral, and said nothing. Amelia shifted in her chair. David fiddled with his pen. It was subtle, but I knew Collins noticed. His need for control was slipping. Later that afternoon, he cornered me in the hallway. "Emily," he said, voice low and urgent, "I know how audits can be. Sometimes people misrepresent things to make themselves look good. I need to know you won't confuse the auditors." I almost laughed. Confuse the auditors? That was his way of asking if I'd betray him. "I'll answer their questions honestly," I said softly. He searched my face for weakness. Finding none, he stepped closer. "You think honesty will protect you?" His breath was sharp with coffee and tension. "You're naive if you do." I didn't flinch. I just let the silence stretch until he walked away, his shoes clicking too fast against the tiles. That night, Sarah and I sat at my kitchen table again, papers spread out like a war map. She tapped the stack of backups I had made. One on a flash drive, one on a cloud account, one printed and hidden in her apartment. "You've thought of everything," she said. "Not everything," I admitted. "He's unpredictable. If he feels cornered, he'll lash out." And lash out he did. 2 days later, I received an email from HR. Polite, formal, but with an undertone of suspicion. They wanted to review a concern about my performance. The complaint, they said, alleged that I had misrepresented my contributions on recent projects. My stomach turned cold. Collins had made his move. The HR meeting was set for the next morning. I walked in with my folder clutched tight, every nerve on edge. The HR manager, a woman named Claire, gave me a professional smile that didn't quite hide her curiosity. "Emily, we've received a report questioning the extent of your involvement in certain projects," she said. "We'd like to understand your perspective." I laid the folder on the table. My voice was calm even. "I anticipated this might happen. Here are draft versions of the projects in question showing my authorship. Metadata is included. You'll see the progression from my initial work to the final versions Mr. Collins presented." Her brows lifted slightly. She flipped through the pages. The silence in the room was heavy. After a long pause, she said, "Thank you, Emily. We'll take this into account." I walked out with my heart pounding, but inside, I knew I had just shifted the battlefield. Collins had tried to preempt me, to paint me as a liar before I could speak. Instead, I had handed HR a map of the truth. The next day, I caught Collins watching me from across the office. His smile was tight, brittle. For the first time, I saw something raw in his expression. Not arrogance, not anger, but desperation. He knew I was ready. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the audit began, there would be no turning back. The morning of the audit, the office felt like a stage before a performance. Everything looked the same. The humming lights, the ringing phones, the murmur of coworkers, but underneath the tension was a living thing. I dressed with precision that day. A dark suit, hair neatly pulled back, minimal makeup. I wanted no distractions, no excuses for anyone to dismiss me as emotional or unprofessional. I wanted to look like exactly what I was. Prepared, serious, unshakable. The auditors arrived mid-morning. 2 of them, strangers in gray suits, their faces unreadable. They set up in the large conference room, spreading laptops and files like surgeons preparing instruments. When they called my name, my pulse jumped, but my steps were steady. Collins was already in the room, leaning back in his chair with forced ease. He smiled when I entered, but his eyes were sharp, predatory. The lead auditor, a man named Jensen, gestured toward me. "Emily, we'd like to begin with your role in the Meridian account. Could you walk us through your contributions?" Collins leaned forward, ready to pounce, but I spoke first. "Of course," I said, sliding a slim binder onto the table. "I've prepared documentation. Here are my original drafts, created in March with metadata included. This next section shows the version history, and here," I flipped the page, "is the final presentation Mr. Collins delivered in April. As you can see, the structure, language, and data are directly derived from my earlier drafts." The room went silent except for the faint scratch of Jensen's pen. He examined the pages, nodding slightly. The other auditor leaned in, scanning the side-by-side comparisons. Collins shifted. "With respect," he said smoothly, "these documents only show preliminary work. I refined them, added insights, shaped the narrative. That's leadership, not theft." I kept my voice calm. You'll notice on slide 14, for instance, the competitor analysis. My version includes Company X, which he removed. The missing data created a discrepancy during the client meeting. The second auditor looked up. "That's the discrepancy the Meridian team flagged, isn't it?" Collins's jaw tightened. "Minor details. The bigger vision was mine." Jensen tapped the page with his pen. "But the backbone appears to be Emily's." Heat rushed to my face, but I held steady. The auditors asked more questions, and with each one I answered with documentation, not accusation. Drafts, memos, email timestamps. Each piece was another brick in the wall closing around him. Collins grew defensive, his voice louder, his words less polished. The charm that had once dazzled was cracking under scrutiny. At one point, Jensen turned to him directly. "Mr. Collins, can you provide similar documentation showing your contributions before these drafts?" There was a pause, a beat too long. Collins smiled tightly. "Not on hand, no." The silence that followed was damning. When the session ended, the auditors thanked me and dismissed me from the room. I gathered my binder and walked out, every step echoing with adrenaline. Outside, Amelia caught my eye as I passed. She gave the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Collins was still in there trying to spin his story. But I had planted the truth firmly in the record. The auditors had seen it. They couldn't unsee it. For the first time in months, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Not in his favor, but in mine. This was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of his downfall. The days after my audit session were thick with tension. The office was the same on the surface. People tapping at keyboards, phones buzzing, printers humming. But underneath, everyone felt the shift. Whispers moved like smoke through the cubicles. Something was happening, and Collins was at the center of it. I noticed the change in him immediately. He was no longer the untouchable golden boy striding through the halls with effortless charm. Instead, he was restless. His laugh came too loud, his jokes too forced, his eyes darting from face to face as though measuring who might still be loyal. For years, Collins had thrived on invisibility, the quiet theft of credit that no one noticed until it was too late. But the audit had dragged him into the spotlight, and under that light, his flaws gleamed. I kept my head down, but not too far. Enough to look diligent, steady, neutral. Enough to let others start noticing what I had always seen. The first crack came during a leadership meeting. I wasn't in the room, but Amelia filled me in afterward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He snapped," she whispered over lunch. "One of the VPs asked about a chart, something basic, and he lost it. Raised his voice. Said he didn't need to be interrogated like a criminal." I blinked. Collins never snapped. He was the master of smooth, even under pressure. Losing his temper in front of executives was unthinkable. Did anyone defend him? I asked. Amelia shook her head. No. They just stared. I smiled faintly into my coffee. The cracks were spreading. The second crack came a few days later during a client call. I was in the room this time taking notes when Collins stumbled over a question about the Meridian data. Normally, he would have spun it, charming the client with confidence. Instead, he grew flustered, over-explaining until the client interrupted. Maybe Emily can clarify, the client said. The room went silent. Collins's face froze, then twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said through clenched teeth. Emily, why don't you explain? I did calmly, clearly with facts. The client nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Afterward, Collins cornered me in the hallway. His voice was low, venomous. Enjoy that moment? You think you're winning. I met his gaze, my voice steady. I think the truth is winning. His jaw clenched. He turned and walked away. The third crack was the most telling. HR called me in again, this time not with suspicion but with curiosity. Claire, the manager, leaned forward across the desk. Emily, she said, the auditors have raised concerns about discrepancies in Mr. Collins's records. We'd like to ask you some follow-up questions. I answered each one with precision. Yes, I had the original drafts. Yes, I had observed Collins presenting them as his own. Yes, I had colleagues who could corroborate. When I left, Claire's expression lingered in my mind, professional, but laced with something else. Distrust. Not of me, but of him. By the end of that week, Collins was a man unraveling. His emails grew curt, almost frantic. He scheduled unnecessary meetings, as though trying to reassert control. He lingered too long outside HR's office. His mask was slipping and people were noticing. And me? For the first time since this war began, I felt something close to peace. Not because it was over, it wasn't, but because the balance had shifted. For so long I had been the hunted. Now, Collins was the one on the defensive. I knew Act 4 had only begun. His fall wasn't complete. Not yet. But I could see it now, inevitable, unstoppable, like a structure already burning from the inside. All I had to do was wait and push at the right moments. Desperation has a smell. It's sharp, sour, unmistakable. By the second week of the audit, that smell clung to Collins like cologne. He began working longer hours, staying late in the office, as though effort could rewrite history. I'd pass his office at night and see the glow of his computer screen, his silhouette hunched over the keyboard. Sometimes he'd glance up and catch me watching. His expression was no longer smug. It was tight-hunted. The first desperate move came on a Tuesday morning. An email went out to the entire leadership team with a lengthy strategic memo attached. Collins claimed it was a forward-looking vision for the company. Innovative, disruptive, uniquely his. But it wasn't. It was mine. A proposal I had drafted months earlier, abandoned when leadership shifted priorities. He had dug through old archives, polished the language, and sent it out as though inspiration had struck him overnight. I stared at the email, fury bubbling, but then I smiled, because this time I was ready. I still had the original file, complete with creation date, my name in the metadata, and comments in the margins from Amelia. Within an hour, I quietly forwarded it to HR and the auditors with a short note. For context, please see the attached draft from February, which matches much of Mr. Collins's memo. No accusations. No dramatics. Just context. By the next day, the memo was a running joke. People whispered in the break room about Collins's big vision, smirking as they did. I didn't need to say a word. The auditors already had the proof. The second desperate move came during a team meeting. Collins singled me out in front of everyone. Emily, he said with a brittle smile, why don't you explain to the group how you've been spending your time? After all, audits can be distracting. We want to make sure you're focused on the team's goals. It was a trap, a chance to make me defensive, emotional, maybe even slip up. But I didn't take the bait. I smiled politely. Of course. I've been focused on the Meridian follow-ups and the Horizon proposal. Both are on track for next week's deadlines. Would you like me to circulate a progress update? The room went still. I had given him nothing to attack, only professionalism he couldn't undermine. Amelia smirked into her coffee cup. Collins's smile faltered. He nodded stiffly and moved on, but the damage was done. The team had seen him try to corner me and fail. The third desperate move was the boldest. Late one evening, as I was packing my bag, Collins appeared at my desk. His tie was loosened, his eyes bloodshot, his voice low and urgent. "Emily," he said, "we don't need to let this audit ruin everything. You and I both know how politics work. We could present a united front. Say the projects were joint efforts, collaborative. I'll give you credit publicly. More opportunities. Promotions even. But only if you back me up." I studied him for a long moment. This was the man who had stolen my work, belittled me, tried to crush me under false complaints. And now he was offering me scraps of recognition, like a dog tossing leftovers. "I don't want your credit," I said evenly. "I want the truth." His jaw tightened. For a second I thought he might explode. But then he forced a smile, patted my desk and walked away. That night I sat alone in my apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of it all. Collins was slipping faster and faster. And I was no longer just defending myself. I was watching him fall. By the third week, Collins wasn't just unraveling, he was coming apart at the seams. The polish was gone. The crisp suits, the controlled tone, the carefully rehearsed charm. All of it had slipped away, leaving a man raw with fear. His desperation turned violent, though not with fists. No, his weapon was words. It started small. A snide remark about my lack of loyalty in a department meeting. A passive-aggressive jab about junior staff needing hand-holding. Each time I let it roll past me, answering with facts, not fire. The more composed I was, the more unhinged he appeared. Then came the explosion. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the office hums with quiet productivity. The auditors had just left his office after another round of questioning. His door slammed so hard that the blinds rattled in their frames. Moments later, he stormed into the open workspace. His face was red, his tie askew, and his voice carried like thunder. "This is a witch hunt," he barked. "And I know exactly who's behind it." His eyes locked on me. Every head in the room turned. The air went cold. "You think you're clever, don't you, Emily?" His voice cracked, sharp and desperate. "Sending little notes, whispering in corners, pretending you're innocent. You're not. You've been undermining me from the start. Jealous, petty, ungrateful." The room was silent. Colleagues stared in shock. Amelia's jaw dropped. Someone's coffee mug hit the desk with a dull thud. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply closed my laptop, folded my hands, and looked at him. Calm. Steady. "Collins," I said softly, "you should sit down." Those 5 words landed heavier than a shout. Because everyone saw it, the contrast. His fury, my composure. His accusations, my restraint. He was unraveling in real time, and I was the quiet eye of the storm. The auditors returned minutes later, drawn by the noise. Collins tried to smooth things over, muttering about stress and deadlines. But it was too late. They had witnesses. They had context. And they had already been circling him like vultures. That night, Amelia called me. Her voice was tinged with awe. "You didn't even blink," she said. "He came at you like a madman, and you just let him hang himself." I smiled into the phone. "Sometimes the best push," I said, "is no push at all." Because Collins wasn't just falling anymore. He was crashing. The day after Collins' public outburst, the atmosphere in the office shifted completely. People who once whispered in corners now spoke openly. Not about me, but about him. His authority had cracked, and once a crack appears, it spreads like wildfire. I watched from my desk as he shuffled through the halls, shoulders slumped, muttering under his breath. He still wore the same suits, but they hung looser now, wrinkled from restless nights. The shine in his eyes was gone. For years he had fed off fear. But now? He was the one being avoided. Doors closed when he approached. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter resumed only after he passed. The auditors tightened their grip. Every day more files were pulled, more emails examined. Collins tried to rally his allies, but his circle had shrunk to nothing. Even the ones who had defended him the longest, out of loyalty or fear, began quietly slipping away. And then the final mistake. It was a Friday afternoon when Collins burst into the boardroom during an executive meeting. His voice was hoarse, his words frantic. "This is a setup," he shouted. "I've been framed. Someone planted those discrepancies. Someone's feeding you lies." He was shaking, his hands trembling as he pointed at faces around the table. "You're all in on it. You want to see me destroyed because you're jealous of what I've built." The executives didn't argue. They didn't shout back. They just sat there, cold and silent, letting him burn himself out. I stood in the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, and watched him unravel. And I realized something. He wasn't fighting to save the company anymore. He was fighting to save the illusion of power he had built his whole life around. When his rant collapsed into silence, the chair of the board cleared her throat. Her voice was calm, measured, final. "Mr. Collins, I think it's best you step outside." Security escorted him out. The entire office watched as he walked down the corridor, not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the broken gait of a man who knew the end had arrived. That evening, I sat by my window, the city lights flickering below. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Revenge isn't complete when the villain falls on their own. Revenge is complete when the truth is undeniable, when the world sees them exactly as they are. And for that, I had one final move left. I knew Collins was finished the moment security escorted him out of the boardroom. But finishing him wasn't enough. He had spent years manipulating, abusing, and destroying people's confidence, mine included. His downfall couldn't just be a private affair whispered in corporate hallways. It had to be undeniable, public, permanent. That night, I opened the folder I had been keeping hidden. The one no one knew about. Inside were copies of emails, contracts, and memos Collins had signed himself, all pointing to a pattern of deceit. He hadn't just bent the rules. He had broken them systematically, building his empire on lies. For months, I had collected them quietly. Screenshots here, documents there, tucked away in a cloud drive under a name no one would ever guess. Insurance, I had called it then. A safety net for a rainy day. But now? Now it was the sword. The next morning, I walked into the office early. The halls were quiet, the air heavy with unease after the spectacle of Collins' meltdown. I plugged in my laptop, took a deep breath, and drafted a single email. It wasn't long. Just a few sentences. To the board of directors, please find attached documentation that may assist your ongoing review of Mr. Collins' conduct. These files demonstrate a repeated pattern of falsified financials, misappropriation of funds, and direct instructions to manipulate staff compliance. I believe they speak for themselves. Emily, I attached the folder and hit send. My hands shook as I pressed the key, but once it was done, a calm washed over me. This wasn't just my revenge anymore. This was justice. By noon, the board had called an emergency session. I wasn't invited, of course, but whispers spread like wildfire. The documents were being passed around. People were stunned, not just by the fraud itself, but by how blatant it was once laid bare. Collins had built a castle of cards, and I had just pulled the cornerstone. For the first time since this war began, I allowed myself to smile. Because I knew the final move had been made. The board meeting stretched for hours. I didn't know the details, but I didn't need to. The looks on people's faces as they left the conference room told me everything. Some were pale, shaken. Others were angry, muttering under their breath. And a few looked almost relieved, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from the company's chest. By late afternoon, an all-staff meeting was called. Mandatory. Every employee filed into the auditorium, filling the rows with a nervous, buzzing silence. I sat in the back, hands folded, heart steady. The chairwoman of the board stood at the podium. Her voice carried not with anger, but with the solemn weight of truth. After a thorough review of recent events and documentation provided, she began, the board has reached a unanimous decision regarding Mr. Collins. You could hear a pin drop. Her words fell like hammer blows. Effective immediately, Mr. Collins has been terminated from his position. An external investigation is underway regarding potential financial misconduct. The company will fully cooperate with authorities. Gasps filled the room. A few people exchanged glances wide-eyed. Some shook their heads in disbelief. But then came the line that sealed it. The actions uncovered were not mistakes or oversights. They were deliberate. They do not reflect the values of this organization, nor will they ever be tolerated again. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. And then a ripple of whispers spreading like wildfire. Collins wasn't just gone. He was branded. As employees filed out, I heard snippets of conversations. I can't believe it. All those years. No wonder everything felt off. He fooled us all. For the first time, people weren't afraid to say his name. They weren't shielding him with silence. They were speaking the truth out loud, and the sound of it was liberating. I lingered in the back, letting it wash over me. No one looked at me with suspicion anymore. No one whispered about me in corners. They knew the truth now. They knew who the real villain had been all along. And Collins? He was finished. Not just unemployed. Not just disgraced. He was unmasked. The empire he had built on intimidation and deceit was gone, crumbling to ash in a single afternoon. And I was the one who had lit the match. Collins didn't just lose his job. He lost everything. Within days, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines painted him as the fallen golden executive, the man who built a company on lies. Articles dissected every misstep, every fraudulent report, every manipulative tactic. His face, once a symbol of authority and power, was plastered across screens for all the wrong reasons. Not as the visionary leader he fancied himself to be, but as a fraud. The investigation deepened. Authorities launched inquiries into missing funds, tax discrepancies, and suspicious offshore accounts. What the board had seen in my folder was only the beginning. Collins had left a trail, and now every misdeed was being unearthed. Colleagues who once tiptoed around him now spoke freely to investigators. Old stories surfaced, of bullying, of intimidation, of people silenced under his thumb. His entire legacy was rotting in the open air. And personally, he was a ghost. His home, once a venue for glittering parties, stood dark and empty. His family, exhausted by years of his arrogance, quietly distanced themselves. Friends stopped returning his calls. Invitations vanished. I heard whispers that he'd been seen at a bar one night, unshaven, slumped over a glass, ranting to anyone who would listen that he'd been betrayed. That people had turned on him unfairly. That he was the victim. But no one bought it anymore. The mighty Collins had been reduced to a cautionary tale. And me? I watched it all unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and heaviness. Because revenge is never clean. There's no neat bow that ties everything together. His destruction didn't erase the nights I cried in silence. It didn't erase the anxiety, the self-doubt, the scars he left on my confidence. But it did something else. It showed me that monsters fall. That even the most untouchable tyrants can be dragged into the light. The world saw him for what he truly was. And that, I realized, was enough. The office felt different after Collins was gone. The shadows he had cast were lifting, slowly but surely. People spoke louder, laughed more freely. Meetings no longer felt like battlefields. For the first time in years, I could walk through those halls without my chest tightening, without bracing myself for the next jab, the next manipulative twist. I sat by the window one evening, the city glowing beneath me, and let myself breathe. Really breathe. For so long I had been surviving. Enduring. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now I wasn't waiting anymore. I was free. But freedom has a strange taste after you've lived in chains. Revenge wasn't sweet. It wasn't a rush of triumph or the kind of victory you see in movies. It was quieter. Heavier. It came with the sobering knowledge that justice doesn't heal everything. It only clears the path for healing to begin. Collins was gone, yes. Exposed, ruined, stripped of everything he had used to control others. But the scars he left? Those were mine to carry. And yet I realized something. Those scars didn't define me anymore. They weren't reminders of weakness but of survival. Proof that I had endured, fought back, and won. I didn't destroy Collins with fury or chaos. I destroyed him with patience. With truth. With the quiet, unyielding resolve of someone who refused to stay broken. And in that I found my closure. As I closed my eyes that night, I whispered the words I had waited so long to say. It's over. And for the first time in years I believed it.